Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. And today I want to talk a little bit about the idea of the self. And I'm hoping that this might be helpful for anybody who's found Buddhist teachings about the idea of a self or no self to be a bit baffling. Because you might be aware that in Buddhism there's a doctrine called anatta. It's often translated as no self or not self. And the first time I heard about this, I was quite troubled. And for one reason, it was the idea that not having a self was a bit disturbing. Does that mean I don't exist? And I was also worried that this was some kind of intellectual challenge that I wouldn't get. Some concept I had to grasp, and I wasn't going to be clever enough to understand it. It turns out there's good news. The Buddha didn't actually say there is no self. What he said was that any questions about whether or not there's a self or what it is, not actually necessary, they're not helpful. And sitting having philosophical arguments about whether or not there's a self doesn't actually lead to the end of suffering. It doesn't reduce our levels of stress. So we can all relax about that one. But I want to look at what he did teach. Because in India, 2,500 years ago, at the time of the Buddha, there was a prevailing belief that we have a permanent, undying soul. And it's also worth saying that there was a real culture of debate at that time. And there are all sorts of spiritual seekers who really love to compete with each other and try and win arguments with each other. And the Buddha advised his followers just to avoid getting involved in any questions around what am I, or do I exist, or do I have a self? Because they're not important, they just get in the way. And the important question is actually, why am I suffering stress and unhappiness? Why am I full of discontent? And part of the answer to that lies in the way that we grasp and cling to a very fixed, solid sense of self. So let's think about the question, who am I, just for a moment. And you might answer that by describing your job, but of course your job can change. You might talk about your nationality, or your role as a family member, maybe even your personality type. And you could say that you're the molecules in your body, but all of that's changing. It's changing all the time. And these things might describe you, but you can't really say that's me, that's my core essence, and it's fixed forever. Now I know there's something unique about me, and that I very much exist. I've got a name, I've got an identity, I've got memories that I cherish. But I'm not so much a fixed thing, more just a number of changing processes like breathing and thinking. And I'm also part of something bigger. I'm dependent on other people, they're dependent on me. What happens in my environment affects me, I affect my environment. So it's not like I'm completely separate from the rest of the world. And I certainly couldn't live independently of other people, other environmental factors. I can't live independent of causes and conditions. And this isn't some obscure philosophical point, for undergraduates to argue about. It's fundamental. It's about reducing a lot of the unnecessary suffering and stress and unease that we all experience every day. So let's start with a sense of interconnectedness, because the reality is that we're profoundly connected to other people, both from a practical point of view, but also emotionally, of course. And when we're under threat, or when we're overcome, or when we're obsessed with something, we forget that. We start to see ourselves as being separate and disconnected from the world. And it becomes us versus them. And some teachers actually talk about selfing as a verb, the process of creating and building our sense of self. And when we shy away from the world, when we contract away from the world around us, we're actively creating a separate, fixed sense of self. So if you use selfing as a verb, it really describes the mental activity that separates us off from others. But when the heart and mind are in balance, there's a sense of opening and space. And when the heart is closed off, the mind takes charge. The mind starts working to protect the sense of self. And it gets busy, it starts tracking and speculating and thinking about what's going to happen or what should have happened. And the mind thinks it needs to be in control of everything in order to protect a sense of self. And it takes the role of manager, and it plays out strategies and scenarios. And it's rather a strange process if you step back and think about it. So here's an example. Have you ever got upset or annoyed with somebody close to you? Maybe somebody that you love. It might be your partner or a sibling or a child or a parent, a close friend or somebody. And maybe you exchanged harsh words, and maybe there was a bit of a miscommunication or something. And you retreated into thinking and feeling like you had to protect yourself. And you started running imaginary conversations. And then when you got over that and everything was okay again, it just stopped. That feeling of separateness disappeared and the feelings of love came back. And suddenly there wasn't a need to strategize. There was no more need to protect your point of view. There was just the connection again. And that shift, when it happens, it can be quite quick. It can be sudden. You could actually observe it next time it happens. Because what you're seeing is the heart and mind contracting and expanding, closing down into a tight ball and then opening up again. And the contraction is what happens when we react to something. And that reaction is driven by an accumulation of pain, emotional pain from the past. And our natural capacity for openness and sensitivity just get overwhelmed. Whether that's by fear or irritation or outrage or whatever thing it is that's triggered us. And although we all have an innate ability to sense into other people's experience and to empathize with others, it disappears sometimes, it just diminishes when we're preoccupied with defending our sense of self. And the mind becomes more critical, it becomes more judgmental, we become more self-righteous, and the whole volume of our thinking gets louder. And the way that we define ourselves, and we define other people and pigeonhole them and categorize them, is all to do with a sense of self. We can develop very fixed ideas about who and what we are. And the sense of self can be reinforced by stories that we tell ourselves. And some of those stories are pretty benign, but some of them are a bit toxic, and they can undermine our confidence, they can render us powerless. And one way to know that the sense of self is overactive is when the mind is comparing. So if you ever look at other people and think they're doing better than I am or they're doing worse than I am, that's the comparing mind. That's when the sense of self is in overdrive. And there's a passage in the Upasata Sutta, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha says, train yourself not to speculate, I'm better than, worse than, the same as. And it's a pretty pointless exercise, so as long as we're comparing ourselves to others, there's no mindfulness, there's no joy in our lives. So coming back to the sense of self, who exactly are you? And I would want to encourage you to see yourself as a process, as a set of processes, if you like, rather than a fixed thing. It's more of a verb than a noun, because it's not solid, it's not fixed. When I say it's not fixed, that includes the fact you've got the capacity to change, to grow and change all the time. So when the sense of self gets to be overwhelming, it's actually really helpful to remember that happiness and ease are right there. They're very achievable for all of us. And when we feel contracted or angry or fearful, these are not default states. They're just visitors. They come and go. Sometimes they're even helpful visitors. And mindfulness practice doesn't mean stamping them out. It just means learning to notice when they're around. And noticing them without judgment, without becoming tangled in self-recrimination. And the teacher Joseph Goldstein recommends just noting what's happening in the passive voice. So instead of I'm angry, just saying there is anger. This is just happening. It's not what I am. It's not who I am. It's going to pass soon. And I think that's a really powerful practice. Although obviously there's a time and a place. If you go into work and say to your colleague, have you responded to my email yet? There is impatience. They might look at you a bit funny. But I just want to be clear, you do exist. There is a you. At the level of personality, there is a sense of independent and unique identity. But it's just maybe not as fixed as we sometimes think it is. And we're not actually as separate as we sometimes feel that we are. But it's still something to be cherished. It's still something to be valued. And sometimes, of course, we really do have to protect ourselves from harm. We protect our boundaries. Because our survival depends on that. We don't have to open ourselves up to the axe murderer and welcome them into our house. We don't have to stay in an abusive relationship, or we don't have to stay in a job when we're being bullied. We can protect ourselves. The teachings about no self don't deny our individual rights. But understanding impermanence and understanding the absence of a solid, fixed self is actually very freeing. It's a liberation. It opens us up to generosity and spaciousness and compassion, and it opens us up to a sense of sufficiency. And we can live according to this understanding, and we can still value ourselves. It doesn't stop us from cherishing our memories, loving the people we love, protecting our own boundaries, all of those things. It just helps us to see past the stories that we tell about ourselves. And it actually might even help us to find out who we really are. So once again, thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us on Kitchen Sink Dharma. Hope to see you next time.